The wind howled through the pines that bordered Bitter Hollow Motel, a forgotten lodge nestled in the shadow of New Hampshire's White Mountains. It was a place where travelers sought solitude, and in the dead of winter, it was rarely occupied. But that morning, a phone call shattered the stillness. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher answered, her voice steady and practiced. There's a body, the manager stammered, his voice shaking. Room 12. You need to send someone, now. When the police arrived, the scene was unlike anything they'd expected. Officers O'Connor and Reyes stepped into the dimly lit room, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. Lying motionless on the bed was a man, eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling, his face contorted in horror. Blackened bruises wrapped around his neck, as if hands had clutched him in his final moments. His name was David Collins. At 32 years old, he was just another visitor, but the way he died was anything but ordinary. A letter lay neatly on the nightstand, an old photograph paperclipped to the corner. In shaky handwriting, the note read, "She's coming for me. No one will believe me, but if I die, it's because of her. Rebecca won't let me go." O'Connor glanced at Reyes, their eyes meeting in silent agreement. This wasn't going to be an ordinary case. Months before his body was discovered at the motel, David Collins had moved back to his hometown in New Hampshire. He had left the city behind, seeking the quiet solace of familiar streets and small-town life after years of working tirelessly. For a while, everything seemed fine. But then, strange things began to happen. It started one evening when he was driving home from work. The road was dark, and the sky was a bruised purple, hints of an approaching storm swirling above. David's mind wandered, thinking of how he had left behind so much to start anew. Suddenly, his brakes failed. The car careened off the road, crashing into a ditch. His vision blurred as he struggled to stay conscious. Through the shattered glass of his window, he caught sight of her, Rebecca. She stood in the shadows, her eyes locked onto his, a cold smile playing on her lips. Then, everything went black. David awoke in the hospital, his head bandaged and his arm in a sling. He tried to explain to the doctors about Rebecca, but they dismissed it as a concussion-induced hallucination. He wanted to believe them, but the image of her lingered in his mind, growing stronger each day. A week later, David returned home, only to find his parents' house in shambles. Windows had been shattered, and stones littered the living room floor. He searched the empty street outside, and there she was again, Rebecca, her face pale and expressionless as she watched him from the darkness. That was when David knew she wasn't just a figment of his imagination. David's life continued to spiral. His paranoia grew as he saw Rebecca's face in every shadow, her presence haunting his every step. Determined to escape the torment, he planned a weekend getaway with his girlfriend, Laura, hoping a change of scenery would break the cycle. The two of them stayed at Laura's apartment, trying to find some semblance of peace. For a while, things felt normal. They laughed, cooked dinner together, and watched the city lights from the balcony. But as they shared a quiet moment, a knock echoed through the apartment. "I'll get it," David said, moving toward the door. But before he could reach it, Laura screamed, a blood-curdling cry that sent chills down David's spine. He turned back to see her stumbling backward, clutching the railing of the balcony. He sprinted to her, but it was too late. He watched in horror as she fell, her body tumbling 4 stories down. David raced to the balcony and looked down. Laura lay motionless, her body crumpled on the pavement below. Beside her, Rebecca stood, staring up at David with an expression that twisted from sorrow into a menacing smile. As he blinked, she vanished, leaving him alone with the growing dread that consumed him. David's world crumbled further. He could no longer find solace or comfort, and the loss of Laura haunted him as much as the relentless image of Rebecca. 2 days after Laura's death, the nightmare deepened when a fire broke out at his parents' house. It happened in the middle of the night, and by the time firefighters arrived, the flames had consumed everything. His childhood home was reduced to ash, and worse, his parents did not survive. As David stood in the ruins, he received a call. The number was unknown, and a sense of dread settled over him as he answered. A woman's voice, cold and filled with malice, laughed on the other end. "You know who this is, don't you, David?" she whispered before hanging up. He recognized the voice. Rebecca's laughter echoed through his mind like a curse he couldn't escape. Frantic, David contacted the police, convinced that Rebecca was behind everything. But his claims were dismissed. When he mentioned Rebecca's name, the officers exchanged glances. One officer, wearing a look of pity, explained that Rebecca had died years ago. There was no way she could be haunting him now. David's desperation turned into paranoia. He felt trapped, cornered by the shadows of his past and the ghost he believed was real. In a moment of panic, he fled the city and sought refuge at the Bitter Hollow Motel, hoping to disappear into the isolation. But even there, the haunting continued. The nights at the Bitter Hollow Motel were endless. Every time David tried to sleep, he felt her presence. The shadows outside his window seemed to move, and the silhouette of Rebecca would linger just beyond the glass, her eyes glowing faintly through the frost. He kept the lights on, hoping the brightness would keep the darkness and her at bay. One night, as he stared at the ceiling, his mind raced with memories of what his life used to be, before everything fell apart. His eyes drifted toward the nightstand where he had placed a picture of him and Laura, a reminder of a life that now felt distant and unreachable. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room. David shot up, his heart pounding. The sound came again, louder this time, from the window. Slowly, he turned, his breath catching in his throat. Rebecca's face pressed against the glass, her eyes meeting his. She mouthed words he couldn't hear, but he felt the chill of her presence deep in his bones. Panicking, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The line crackled as he whispered, "She's here. She's outside my window." But the response was the same as before. No one believed him. His cries for help fell on deaf ears, the operator's voice barely masking the pity he had grown used to. David dropped the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, defeated. She wasn't going to leave him alone. He realized then that there was no escaping her, no matter how far he ran. As the days passed, David's isolation grew. The motel room became a prison where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. Each night, he saw her, Rebecca's presence lingering, her eyes glowing through the frost of his window, her whispering laugh echoing in his mind. Desperate, he wrote everything down. His final letter described the torment he endured, naming Rebecca as the cause of his suffering. He pleaded for anyone who found it to believe him, to understand that she was not a hallucination. "If I die, it's because of her," he wrote, the pen shaking in his hand as he glanced nervously at the window. The police received a call from the Bitter Hollow Motel. By the time they arrived, they found David's lifeless body on the bed. The bruises on his neck were as if someone had strangled him, but there were no other fingerprints in the room. The CCTV footage showed only David entering and leaving his room. There was no sign of anyone else. Detective Harris, leading the investigation, read through David's letter and frowned. The details were unsettling. Harris had seen many cases over the years, but something about this one felt different. He reached out to the police department in the city where David had lived and requested records on Rebecca. The response was shocking. Rebecca had indeed died years ago. Her cause of death was suicide, after a deep depression triggered by her breakup with David. But there was more. Witnesses had reported strange occurrences at her apartment before she died, objects moving on their own, cold drafts, and a feeling of being watched. Harris felt a chill run down his spine as he reviewed the case files. Everything David described in his letter matched what had been reported about Rebecca's last days. Had David inherited her curse? Was it possible that Rebecca's spirit had come back to seek revenge? But with no evidence to support his suspicions, the case was closed, labeled a suicide. The media frenzy died down, and the story faded from the headlines. Months after the case was closed, Detective Harris sat alone in his office, staring at the photograph of David and Rebecca that had been attached to the letter. Maybe he wasn't crazy, he muttered, the silence of the room pressing in around him. Or maybe he was, but what if she really did come back? He pushed the photograph aside and stood, leaving the light on as he left his office. The shadows outside seemed to stretch, and for a moment, he thought he saw a face, pale, with eyes that glowed faintly. He blinked, and it was gone. But the unease remained, lingering like a ghost. Was David truly insane, or was he haunted by Rebecca's vengeful spirit? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And while you're here, check out our latest podcast episode featuring a director who faced real supernatural encounters on set. Don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales. Who knows, the next one might just be waiting outside your window.